Again, welcome everyone to NYLC's International Service Learning Forum. My name is Julie Rogers Bascom, and I'm the Director of Learning and Leadership at NYLC. What that means is that I get to work with teachers and young people to use service learning as a strategy for building young leaders and problem solvers and change makers. Today's conversation is really going to be about facilitating service learning. It is an introduction to, I'm going to go ahead and mute a call there. It is an introduction to the work that we do here at Service Learning, and I'm also really interested in hearing more about the work that you are doing in your classrooms and in your after-school spaces. To get us started, I'll let you know just a little bit about NYLC. Our goal is really to create a more just and sustainable, peaceful world with youth so that they are able to have an impact on their communities. We work with teachers, which like this, where we offer training and technical assistance. We do a lot of personalized workshops. We have a national conference, and we do everything in between. We work with young people where we are working with them on skill development and leadership skills, and we do that in the context of service learning. And then that third bucket of work that we do is really around advocating for the field of service learning. Around 10 or 15 years ago, there was an effort that defunded Learn and Serve America, which was one of the efforts behind this really good and important work. So I want to know who's here. While I see a face, a little square on the right side, I'm really curious who is here. So if you've done Slido before, you know you can go to slido.com and enter that code number. Or if you have a cell phone with you, you can scan that QR code, and that will take you to the website, the slido.com site. And the question is really, tell us where you work with youth and what your role is. So I see that some people are typing, because this is an international conference, a forum. We're really excited to hear from many of you from across the globe. NYLC is located in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we have been in doing this work for almost 40 years. This spring, we will have our 40th anniversary. So Meg is an assistant principal at a school in Denver. Thanks for being here, Meg. Someone from Hobart and William Smith Colleges, fabulous. Somebody from New Foundations, fabulous, really embedded service learning in their school. Terrific. Let's see who else is here. We have teachers, we have community engagement and service learning leaders, director of community engagement from New Foundations. A couple more people I can tell that you're still typing. Wichita, Kansas, student leadership coordinator. You know, one of the things that we are finding so, it used to be 10 years ago, I have a background in working in schools and in after school spaces. It used to be, I remember about 15 years ago, a principal coming up to me, or maybe it was a teacher saying, Julie, we need to teach hard skills. We need science, math, and technology, STEM. But what I'm hearing now is that leadership is really in the forefront of a lot of educators' minds. So I'm glad that we're seeing a lot of student leadership coordinators. Hi, Lisa, nice to see you with the State Commission on Service and Volunteerism. Oh, and Louisiana 4-H development, really important partner, 4-H and the service learning world. East Tennessee, State University, Tennessee, we are excited about coming to Memphis in the spring, where our National Service Learning Conference will be held. I'm going to let one more person finish typing because I see that they, I can see up in my screen.
And actually,
So
Julie,
someone,
sorry, Julie, that's Nashville, just so that everybody's planning their airline reservations correctly.
oh,
Nashville,
okay,
Tennessee, not
thank you.
Memphis.
Not Nashville. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Pam. And somebody from Trinidad and Tobago, welcome. We're going to move ahead at this point. Talk a little bit about our agenda. Today, what we're going to talk about is understanding quality service learning. There's a lot of misinformation or we need to clarify what the difference is between community service and service learning. Both really good and important actions, but we're here to talk about service learning and the outcomes. We're going to consider your why. Why do you want to use service learning in your classrooms or in your out-of-school programs? And also consider ways that you're facilitating service learning in your work with youth. The name of this workshop is really how to facilitate. So we're going to really focus on some of those pathways for facilitation. Real quickly, my question, open up your chat, everyone, because this is for me to make sure that I am meeting your needs. I'm curious, what are you wondering about? Why did you come to this workshop? So open up your chat. And Pam, I'm gonna, for some reason, my chat is disabled. So if you could read what comes into your chat, that would be great. So what are you wondering about? Why did you come to this workshop?
Sure, I can do that, Julie.
Thank you so much. I want you to be engaged, and I want this to be meaningful for you. So did something just pop in, Pam?
We have someone, at least one person, and I know probably more, who are one of our current grantees for their school and wanted to learn more about being part of that. We have someone who is, whoops, they're going so fast I can't read them. We have someone to listen and learn about ways that other instructors and individuals in the field are implementing and conducting service learning. Learning more about service learning to better facilitate meetings as a new Youth Advisory Council coordinator. Learn about facilitating service learning at schools as an informal educator.
Terrific, absolutely.
Getting ideas from others. Get the ball rolling with service learning after COVID. I know some folks had to put things on pause for a while. Learn more about training youth as facilitators so that youth and adults can share space together.
I love it. I love it. One more, Pam.
Okay, just waiting on another entry. Anyone else have a desire to share? Okay, create quality service learning for building up active citizens. And the last one is strategies to teach others how to facilitate and conduct service learning on a larger scale.
Awesome, terrific. Well, I think that we have planned this workshop that will answer some of those questions. We have a full day of really great workshops for y'all. So, and also we're available here to answer any questions post forum. So please feel free to reach out should that be, should you have further questions. I like to start off these conversations with really some definitions. So what is community service? Community service is an activity that engages others in addressing needs of schools and communities. Good and important work, and we have a long history as a country of being engaged in service, in community service. Service learning, I want to point out a couple of different aspects of this definition because I think it's really important. Service learning is an approach to teaching and learning in which students use academic knowledge and skills to address genuine community needs. If you Google the definition of service learning, you will come up with 250 different definitions. So that's why we start right here. And it's important to recognize that first clump of words, an approach to teaching and learning. Service learning isn't a project, it's really a process. It is a pedagogy. It is how we are going about teaching students. There are outcomes, there are goals, learning goals and objectives. And the goals might be leadership. It might be life skills. It might be teaching 21st century skills. But it's really a pedagogy, a way to impart knowledge and to listen to youth voice, one of the standards of quality service learning. So it's an approach to teaching and learning where students use academic knowledge and skills. I would say that they not only use, but they grow academic knowledge and skills, and addressing genuine community needs. Genuine community needs meaningful service. That's one of the standards of quality service learning. And we'll get into talking about that in just one moment. So I want you to think about a time where you have engaged in community service or service learning. And while we aren't necessarily going to be sharing or talking about this in breakout rooms, I do want you to consider an experience, because we're going to apply some standards and we're going to apply some thoughts and some ideas in that example that you're going to be thinking about. So I'm going to give you just a minute to think about what are some ways that you've used community service or service learning. In 2008, NYLC and others did a very huge dive into what makes service learning quality. What are the things that really make for positive youth outcomes, whether it be academically and other life skill? What are the things, what are the elements that differentiate between high quality and another kind of experience that doesn't have the outcomes that we're looking for? And again, we're looking for outcomes for this kind of experience. And I like to start talking about the standards. We're talking about meaningful service. Meaningful service means that it's not just what I think needs to be done in the community, but it's really about providing a service, an experience, knowledge. I think about the different types of service, creating awareness, advocacy, direct and indirect service. Those are the types of service learning. But that meaningful service, that it's important to the community, that really meets a community need. Let me share a story with you. I was working with a group. Actually, I wasn't working with the group, but I heard this story in a 6th grade classroom. And one year they did they tied fleece blankets. And for those of you who live in the cold, you know what that's all about, where you take a layer of fleece, another layer of fleece, you put those together, you cut strips on the side and you tie them together. Well, this group of 6th graders, the teacher and their parents, made blankets for the local homeless shelter. Really a great project. They delivered them. The parents delivered the blankets, and the person at the homeless shelter said, "Oh, thanks." Not the kind of response they were looking for. I think for a lot of different reasons, the parents were concerned because their kids had done this wonderful project and they wanted them to be affirmed, which is a certainly normal response and expectation that you want people to appreciate. So if fast forward to the following year, I was talking to the teacher and I just asked them, well, how did it go? And they said, well, the place didn't seem like they really wanted the blankets. And I said, well, did you talk to them afterwards? And they said, no. And I said, well, why don't you have one of the young people talk to the homeless shelter, one of the volunteer coordinators, and find out what happened, which is reflection, which is one of the standards of quality service learning, before, during, and after. A young person called the homeless shelter, talked to the volunteer coordinator and said, you know, we'd like to be able to help your organization because we really think it's important what you're doing. We'd like to help. Last year we gave you some blankets and it didn't seem like, I don't know, that you didn't like them or didn't want us to do that. And the coordinator said, no, that's not, we love that you want to be of service, that you want to do something that helps us. And thank you for the phone call. But the blankets that you made before did not fit on the mats that the men were sleeping in. So the organization, the school, the classroom, the teachers and the parents had assumed what they knew. They assumed they knew what the center needed. So by the young people calling and saying, what is it you need, which is really a good and important place to start. Service learning done poorly can really reinforce some stereotypes. And we're doing, NYLC is doing some work on in that space, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that later on today in the afternoon in a workshop. Really, what is it? What's the genuine community need that we can meet? First standard. The second standard I like to talk about is that link to curriculum. Again, that's what differentiates community service and service learning. Not always, but it's one of those elements that we want you to think about before you engage in a service learning experience, that link to curriculum. And if I had a magic wand and could change some of the words of these standards, I would say link to learning. For a long time, I think we thought of service learning as being connected only in the classroom. I'm doing a lot of work with out-of-school spaces where they are using service learning to reach some of their goals during the out-of-school space, whether that be leadership or life skills, financial literacy, some of those other reasons why we engage young people in programming. It's not just to keep them busy, but it's really about supporting development of life skills. The third standard that I'll talk a little bit about is reflection. We know that research tells us that reflection is really key for that learning to gel. I was reading a statistic that said something about thinking and reflection relates to increased capacity for learning for young people. Lots of studies about the brain, but knowing that young people are thinking, I think we oftentimes a goal of service learning, one of those hoped for outcomes is for young people to develop empathy. Excuse me, and that's where this can lie, in the reflection space, where they're understanding different perspectives, they're understanding scenarios, they're looking at different scenarios where they're understanding how their view of the world might be different than somebody else's. So that reflection before, during, and after. And that doesn't have to be just talking. I encourage you to think about, when you're planning your experiences, your service learning experiences, and notice I say experiences rather than saying a service learning project. I encourage you to weave reflection in before you start doing your service process, and during the service process, and definitely afterwards, because we know that service learning is sometimes a project, an experience. When you're done with that project, there's still work to be done. There still is. You may have solved one part of an issue, a community need, but oftentimes that brings up another opportunity for change. The fourth standard I like to talk about is diversity. And clearly we think about racial diversity and cultural diversity, but I want also to expand on that and to have you consider that diversity also means different perspectives. One of the greatest gifts we can impart on our young people is helping them to see things from different perspectives. I'll give you an example. I was working with a 7th grade class in their science. The standard they were addressing was human impact on the environment. A standard that I would imagine most schools and districts have? How do the behavior of people, how does that impact the environment? So they did a walkabout of their school, which is the first step in service learning in the student learning cycle, which we'll get to in a little bit. They walked around and identified some of the issues in there, just right on in their school. They saw that people weren't picking up after their dogs. That's a community problem. They saw that there was water pooling in the storm drains, and they needed to be cleaned. That's a problem. But they wouldn't have known that had they not looked around. One group came across a storm drain that had a lot of dried salt around. We live in Minnesota. They salt that had been going into the storm drain, and they were a little concerned about that because in some of their research, they found that the creek behind their school had a high salinity level. So they knew that salt was going into the creek behind their school, and that was impacting the life in the water. So they did some research and they thought about, well, who's putting the salt on the parking lot? I said, well, it's the custodians. It's the custodians' fault. So that's our project. We're going to talk to the custodians and tell them not to put salt on in the parking lot or in the sidewalks anymore. So they created a meeting. They made a meeting with the custodians and had a conversation with them and said, you have to stop putting salt on the sidewalks and in the parking lot because it's impacting the water. We want you to stop. That was their action. That was what they were advocating for. But when they talked to the custodians said, but we have had people fall and break their hip on sidewalks if we don't put salt on, and there are accidents that happen in the parking lot. So the young people thought, well, wait a minute, that's really not the project that we want to do. Now, I guess maybe what we need to do, and after learning more from the custodians, that the custodians really measure and plan and keep track of how much salt they put on the sidewalks and in the parking lot. So they switched their project to educating the community on how to reduce the use of salt. So not taking it away, because there's a real impact if we have icy streets and sidewalks. So that understanding a different perspective, that diverse perspective, was really, really important for the young people. And it changed the trajectory of what their action was. Again, we like to think about, let's do that investigation first. We'll talk a little bit when we get into the student learning cycle. So the next standard that we talk about, youth voice. Youth voice. It is how do we engage young people in solving our community problems? I think we start first by having them identify the issues, because if they own it, we know that youth voice is really connected to agency and engagement. So encouraging young people to identify the issues that they would like to solve is really important. And this is where the facilitation, when we think about the youth voice, of really how do we listen to young people? How do we encourage them to dig deeper? And part of that is in the investigation stage, but part of encouraging youth voice is really about giving them ownership. That's sometimes hard to do in a classroom when you've got a schedule. Service learning can be very messy, admittedly, but that youth voice, how do you tap into that? It looks different at different age levels, and youth voice doesn't mean you say, okay, you do it yourself. I would encourage you to consider how you partner with young people. So they bring what they can to the table, and adults bring what you bring to the table. Adults are bringing experiences and knowledge and ideas that might be different than young people. But let's figure out how we tap into the youth voice and youth ideas, youth voice, which leads me to partnerships. I think one of an important standard that differentiates between community service and quality service learning. Who are you working with in your communities that support the efforts that your students and you are trying to embark on. An example of this, remember I talked about the students who were working on water quality? Well, there was this group in that same class. Their idea, after they did research and looked at water tables and did some measurements of drainage, they identified that if there were permeable surfaces, that more water would go into the ground and be filtered before it got to the creek and impacting the salinity of the creek. So they came up with a proposal to the city council that 10% of new construction must include permeable surfaces. Now that took a while to get to, and again, that goes back to investigation. But they presented at the city council. The city council listened to them. They said, no, we're not at a point where we can do that. Sometimes service learning, our efforts, our projects, they don't work out. I do have to say, 15 years later, it is now a requirement. So I like to think of those 7th graders as being the start of that conversation and that change of perspective, that change of legislation or guidance. Getting back to the story, while they didn't change the ordinance at that point, but what did happen the next year is that city council came back to me and said, we want to hear what your young people have to say. We want to hear what they're concerned about. So it created a partnership with the city council and city decision makers. They started seeing youth as stakeholders instead of kids these days. It's a really great example of how partnerships take a while to develop, but are really important to the process of quality service learning. The next standard is progress monitoring. As teachers, you're already doing this. You're creating summative and formative assessments. You're looking at how young people are meeting standards. So you're already doing this. If you are in an out-of-school program, I encourage you to think about, how do you know you are on the right track? How do you know that young people are meeting the needs, that they're meeting your outcomes, meeting what you want to see happen? And then that last standard, duration and intensity, that's really, the research tells us that those projects that are just show up and do an activity once or a couple of hours don't have the same impact as when your young people are involved in a process that includes the student learning cycle, the IPARD process. We'll talk about that next. So again, the research tells us there is more impact on outcomes, learning outcomes, and also leadership outcomes when it is over a period of time. What time period? I don't have I think that depends developmentally. I think a semester-long project for a high schooler is very different than a semester-long project for an elementary school student. But just consider that it's not a one and done experience. Questions or comments? And Pam, again, I don't know why my chat is not working. So if you see anything new, if you could share with me.
Sure, I'll do that. Go ahead and put any comments or questions in the chat. I do see there might be a few connectivity issues. Some people seem to be going out of the room and coming back, so there might be a little disruption there.
Okay. I'm going to move forward. This is kind of the heady part, the thick stuff. So I'm going to go through this quickly. We have lots of resources on our website. If you go to nylc.org/resources, you will come to some great materials like getting started in service learning. All of this is located in that space. Pam, do you have your hand up?
I do. So we had one question. How do you approach conversation with adults who are hesitant to take youth seriously?
How do you approach adults? Um, I approach adults with outcomes. You know, what is it that you want young people to be able to do? And if it is learning, if it's a learning outcome, then I ask again, how best can young people learn this? How best can they do it? How can they own their learning? And I think there's a lot of research and effort and movement for youth-directed youth engagement, youth agency. So I go back to some of those questions around what are the outcomes? It is hard. Teaching service learning, facilitating service learning is a different way. It's not a stand and deliver kind of content. It's really about encouraging young people to get messy, get their hands in the learning space. So there are some teachers that this might not be a good strategy, a good pedagogy. Admittedly, I think it's one of the ways that I see young people excited about, and that they remember those kinds of experiences. So maybe there are some teachers that this isn't the right space, and maybe it's little by little. You know, start small. Those 8 standards of service learning can be overwhelming when you think about, oh my gosh, I've got to do all of these 8 standards to make it quality. Start with 1. Start with a meaningful service, or start to link to curriculum, link to learning. Weaving that into your unit plan or into your lesson plan, that is a step in the right direction. It is doing things differently. You know, I think that guide on the side versus sage on the stage. There are times that you still need to be the sage on the stage. There are times that you still need to be the person who says to provide the direct instruction. And again, youth voice doesn't mean that young people direct everything. It's really in partnership. So I'm going to move along to the stages of service learning. And I referenced these a little earlier. Stage 1 is we're really encouraging you to start with your desired outcomes. What is it? What are the standards or learning goals or character development or leadership? What are those goals that you're hoping your young people in this experience will meet? So starting with that. The next stage, as in the classroom work that you are doing, is determine acceptable evidence. How will you know young people absorb this, are able to know or replicate or demonstrate that they know this? So you're already probably, if you're a classroom teacher, you are creating assessments around that. The third stage is where we're going to talk a little bit more about facilitation. We call it the IPARD process. It's the student experience cycle, the student learning cycle. IPARD stands for investigation, planning and preparing, action, reflection, and demonstration. Our next slide will talk a little bit more about that. And then that last stage is really about self-assessment. What went right? What still needs to be done? How could we have done something different? What are the things that we can celebrate? What are the things that we did really right? Kind of the affirmative inquiry of identifying what went well and using that to improve the next time around. So as I said, we were going to talk a little bit more about the student learning cycle, because that's where I see a lot of teachers when they're starting out focusing on this stage. And there, you know, we could probably do a workshop on each one of these steps in the service learning process, in the IPARD process. But I do want to talk a little bit about what facilitation looks like at each of those stages. Now, as a teacher, as a facilitator, having some kind of framing around where you start. Sometimes it's really hard in a math class to come in and say, okay, what kind of community problem do you want to solve? in our math class. But what you can do is walk into a classroom and say, we are going to be meeting this standard X. We are going to use our calculus learning goals to solve a community problem. So starting there. So starting with kind of a frame of where you're entering into a service learning space. And then that first stage, that investigation, is really important. Oftentimes, I don't think it's just young people. Oftentimes we jump right to the project, but that's where we can get into trouble. Like the example that I shared with you earlier about the blankets. There was no investigation. In fact, the young people didn't even know in the first instance, they didn't know where the blankets were going or why there was a need for blankets or what the statistics were about homelessness and unhoused people in their community. So really starting with that inquiry, that investigation, and that's where you can dig into different facilitation strategies. If any of you have used a Q matrix, a question matrix, it's a great tool to really lead young people in coming up with some deeper level, higher depth of knowledge questions. A Q matrix, you can Google it has questions on words on the top and words on the bottom, and you put those together and you come up with the sentence stems of how to investigate your issue. I was working with a 4th grade class. The issue they decided to address, and it was a 4th grade English, it was part of their English language arts session. And they decided they were going to work on making their school a more welcoming place. So they used this Q matrix to come up with all sorts of ideas and questions which helped lead them to investigation. For instance, one of the questions was, what are places where young people are not feeling welcome? That was one of the questions that they were examining. So they had to figure out, how do we find that out? So they decided that they were going to do a walk around and look at places, and they created a score card of 1, 2, 3, or 4. 4th grade, they did this, certainly with the help of their adult, but it was they owned this. They came up with the idea, the project, the projects actually. They came up with the issue. That second phase, that second step in the service learning process, or in the IPARD process, is planning and preparation. This usually, after the investigation, you take all that information, and that's when you decide on the project. After that, you're doing the planning and preparation with students. You're identifying who needs to, how do you create a timeline, a budget, a project plan? And those are questions in terms of facilitating that step. Those are really great questions to ask young people to come up with age-appropriate strategies and outcomes. You might even be able to use that as one of your assessments. Come up with a project plan, come up with a timeline. Those are opportunities where young people are able to demonstrate their knowledge at that point. We also, just FYI, there are lots of resources in the NYLC Resource Center. Those documents that might help you and help your young people come up with or answer some of those planning and preparation questions. The third part of the IPARD process is action. And I think I mentioned earlier, I think of action in not just being of service. Oftentimes in service learning, we think we have to go on a field trip to do service learning. But I've seen, just like that example I was sharing with you with the 4th graders coming up with the issue of making our school a more welcoming place. They didn't have to go on any field trip. They invited people in for their investigation and their planning and preparing. So action does not have to be a field trip, direct or indirect service. It can be creating awareness. One of the things that those 4th graders did in their service learning experience is that they wanted to educate people on how to create a welcoming environment on the playground. So they made a video on how to ask somebody to play with them. So a fourth grader, Timmy, who loved video, so using his skills, talents, and interests, he created a video and demonstrated what it would be like if you were a fourth grader on the playground, or a kindergartner, or a second grader. If you're a young person on the playground, how do you go up to somebody and ask if you can join in their play? So really demonstrating, creating that awareness. So there's creating awareness, there's doing research that another entity could use it to have an impact in some of the programming that they do. My kids, the reason I'm doing this work is because my kids were involved in a school in Oakland, California, where every year, every young person did some kind of service learning. In third grade, they did a bird census. And so they did every 2 weeks, the third graders would go to Lake Merritt and count the number of birds. And then at the end, they would present that information to the DNR. And the DNR used that information to help in their planning and execution of their goals and objectives. So action, awareness, research, direct and indirect service. I'd also encourage you to consider how advocacy, changing systems, that is also service learning. Our young people are so involved. I was excited about the election day results, that they're saying that young people were really encouraged to get out and vote. So that advocacy aspect. But the action, all the facilitation alignment in that action stage is really encouraging young people to capture what is happening during that action phase, because as we get to the demonstration, they will need to reflect on that. They will need, as part of their demonstration, they'll need to tell the world how they were impacted, but also how they have created impact. Reflection, as I mentioned before, during, and after the experience, every step of the way, you are facilitating reflection. For older students, you can encourage them to be the leaders of reflection. I'm working with a group in California right now on some policy issue change that young people are in the midst of, and we are actually training them to be facilitators. So that is another way, another step in the ladder of youth adult partnerships, where you're encouraging youth voice. So reflection, again, it's not just, it doesn't have to be talking or written. It could be through art, it could be through video, it could be through poems, it could be through movement, dance. There are lots of ways to reflect. And I might add, that's also another way for you to do some kind of progress monitoring or assessment. This last stage, demonstration, really important. Some people call this demonstration and celebration. Absolutely, demonstration is part of the celebration, but I encourage you to go past the, oh, let's celebrate how good we are, or how lucky we are. I can encourage you to think that demonstration is connected to learning. It's a demonstration of learning. So we are telling the world the kind of impact we made, the kind of impact we made, the change that we felt. I think service learning is transformational. So I want us to consider that as part of the demonstration, part of the story. But it also helps to spur other people on to engaging in problem solving. I know that when young people tell me about, well, this is how you can reuse, we did this project with fifth graders, and they came up, their learning goal was to demonstrate how to reuse things that normally just get thrown away. So young people were going on the internet and finding ways to reuse plastic bottles or reuse tissue paper. One young person took a bleach bottle, cut it out, and used it as a scoop. Now, that had impact on me. So learning through the demonstration, going through that demonstration experience, I learned something that I could do, and have since encouraged my young people, my own kids, to do similarly. So if there's one thing you take from this conversation today, it's really this statement: is service learning is a process, not a project. I'm going to stop now because I have been doing a lot of talking, and I think this scenario doesn't always lend itself to a lot of give and take. But if anybody has a question, if you could turn your mic on and just share a question right now. I'm going to do a little bit of an interactive opportunity here. I'm going to explain this scenario, and I want you to share in the chat. Pam will have to help me. I'm not sure why that function isn't working for me. But in the chat, share, where does this align? Is it more towards community service, more towards service learning, or what can you do using the standards? How can you move that closer to service learning? So the scenario is this: Washington Senior High has a food drive in partnership with the local food bank and pizza shop. 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders compete to see which class can collect the most food. They hold their drive during the fall because it helps families during the holidays. The class that collected the most food was given a pizza party and a day at the movies. Students got to choose the movie and the toppings for the pizza. So share with me, share with me, is it closer to community service, closer to service learning? How could you make it more service learning?
I would say it's closer to community service, and maybe a way to move the needle toward service learning is to educate or create awareness around hunger and the poverty in the local area. Educate the students on that and identify specific needs maybe that you can identify.
Absolutely. Aligning it with the learning goals. I don't see a lot of link to curriculum here, and it's ripe with opportunities. Kimberly, thank you so much. Any other thoughts how to move it closer to service learning?
I
Julie?
can chime in. I don't.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. And then there's a couple in the chat. Go ahead, Meg.
Okay. I don't see a lot of like student voice in this. So the problem or issue is like defined for them, and they didn't get a chance to like identify the root causes or see how it connects to their community. And I think that's a way you could move it more towards service learning, is have it more student driven and the outcome in the project more student driven.
Yeah, and you used a phrase that I really appreciate: root causes. While second graders can't solve world hunger, they can certainly look at, why are there issues? Why do we have hungry neighbors? So digging into some of those underlying causes and inequities is really an important part of a service learning process. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And Julie, for
Pam,
those of
yeah,
for those who commented in the chat, I think we're all on the same wavelength here. Peter had mentioned the same thing you were just talking about, Julie, that the students can investigate why families are food insecure. Are there food deserts? Is it an economic issue? Is it an unemployment concern? Other folks have said kind of the same thing that you and the other commenter were just saying about investigating the need. And then Christy just mentioned that it could be connected through a government course with a connection to the UN Charter and the 17 SDGs. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with that terminology, but there is a sustainable development goal around, I believe it's economic equity and hunger are two of them.
And hunger, yeah, yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, I agree. There's I think many schools and programs do food drive. Again, good and important work. And as institutions of learning, as looking for positive youth outcomes, so how do we move it towards service learning and those hoped for outcomes for youth? I didn't see reflection. but yet this is a snippet. Opportunities for reflection before, during, and after. Thank you. I'm going to read this one because I think this is a robust example. Amherst Elementary School is located by a river. The 6th grade science teacher has her students leave the classroom each week for 7 weeks to study the river's ecology. Students investigated color, clarity, temperature, current and flow, stability, pH and acidity, fish, aquatic insects, as well as the river pollutants. At the end of 6 weeks, the students shared their findings with 3rd graders by creating plays, poster boards, videos, and poems to share what they learned. Students selected the most effective presentation to present to the city's mayor to acknowledge that they have identified there is a need to improve the water quality of the river. I think we all would probably say that this leans towards service learning. Pick out some of those pieces and align them to either standards or the service learning IPARD process. Well, I think we know that there's a lot of link to curriculum because they're investigating all these science concepts. What were the types of service? What was the kind of service that this example demonstrates?
Well, the service, it can be considered to the city because they were able to take the information back to the mayor and with research that there's a need to improve the water quality. I do think you can see the duration and intensity part of this, as well as I guess progress monitoring since it went along the way.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Kimberly. That's really, they were advocating. And I would also say the presentations that they made for the 3rd graders, educating them with plays and poster boards, that was creating awareness. And I think that is a real strong type of service learning. Any other thoughts? Any other additions? I want to talk at this point. I really want to talk a little bit about what's in it for young people, for the adults that work with them in community partners, or the community or the school, because I think we hear, well, why would we use service learning? And I'm here to say that I think there are some really important outcomes that service learning can address. We know that service learning done with fidelity, quality service learning experiences, they increase and tap into 21st century skills, communication, critical thinking, collaboration. Those are all skills that in a service learning process have to be tapped into. I also think in terms of SEL, you cannot do a service learning project without tapping into some of those SEL competencies, the self-awareness, the social awareness, the relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. You can't not have that be a part of a service learning experience. We've been talking a lot about how service learning really can help young people meet their academic goals, so that academic and cognitive development. And I also think civic engagement competencies are an important element of a service learning experience, examining public problems, deliberating with others, and defining and addressing issues. That's real world experiences. And I think it helps us answer the question, which is our next slide really, for teachers. It helps us answer the question, well, why do we have to learn this? How many of you have heard that in a classroom or in working with youth? Why do I need to know this? There was a 3rd grader once who told me, Julie, Mrs. Bascom, math is everything. Math is everything. And I thought, absolutely, math. You use math all the time in a service learning experience because you have to compare and contrast. You have to think about numbers. You have to think about the intersections of months and timelines and all sorts of all sorts of applications to math. So math is everything in service learning. So it's application to the real world. I also think that the whole student engagement and ownership and agency, that is what brings service learning to life. It's the young people saying, oh, well, this is what I've learned in a past experience. Let me apply it now. And I think it's also learning the skills and transferring them to other experiences. I used to run a program called Kids Voting Edina. Edina was a community that I worked in for a while. And there was a young person, what they did was, it was a mock election where they actually went to the poll, and young people voted in their own poll right next to the adults who were voting in the real poll. I saw a young person, this was a while ago, come into the high school with a I voted sticker. And I said, so how'd it go? It looks like you did voting for the first, was it the first time? He said, yes, it was my first time. I was kind of scared. I said, so what'd you do about that? And he said, well, I know that I had done it before in kids voting, so I knew how to do it. So practicing some of those experiences transfers. It transfers. And that's also what we do a lot of talking about as well. I think sometimes service learning you can be sharing the workload. It doesn't feel like that sometimes at first, but I think it's an opportunity to have young people be responsible for some of the planning and the preparation. So it's an opportunity to share that workload. I also think it's an opportunity to work on that classroom community. Now, why is service learning good for schools or the community? I think for me, I go back to that example of the city council. It's really changing the image of young people. Young people are being seen as change makers, a new generation of leaders. And they go from an adult perspective going, oh, kids these days. How many of us have heard that? Oh, kids these days. It goes from there to kids these days. We really want our young people engaged in the kinds of work that we're doing. I'm going to stop again for another pause. Any other reasons for using service learning? What's your why? What's your why of service learning? Why do you want to use service learning? You can put it in the chat, or please feel free to turn your mic on and share with us. What is your reason for using service learning? Why do you want to use service learning? Anyone?
So we have in the chat, applying what youth are learning to life. It gives purpose to learning, and this is what kids need.
Mm-hmm.
Any others? Diane is sharing her whys because she sees that youth are agents of change for a better society. Empowering our youth. I think these are some really powerful and common motivators here. Anything else? Anyone else have one to share? Creating a bond of empathy. Yeah, empowering. Yep, I agree.
Yeah. Empathy, the research that they're doing on empathy and learning is really impactful. And emotion. We know that connecting emotion to learning has a really powerful experience or powerful outcomes too.
Maybe just one more to add before you move on, Julie. As you mentioned, teach our students how to use what they're learning in the classroom outside of the classroom, and bringing different skills in students that they may not show in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's an opportunity for all young people to participate. Let's take a moment and read this screen. This is an example of someone's why of service learning. Effective service learning connects students to their community and helps them see themselves as agents of positive change. It helps them see themselves as agents of positive change. I love that. The research shows that service learning has a positive impact on classroom instruction, and importantly, it teaches students to engage as active citizens and to show compassion and empathy to people in the community. Those are pretty powerful whys. And I encourage you, there was a question earlier about how to engage teachers. Ask them their why of teaching. And maybe this why of service learning can have an intersection with that. So here's our final Slido before I show you some other resources. But just this helps us share what you learned in here, or maybe a new perspective, or maybe this is reinforcing. But what did you hear today that might help you with facilitating service learning with your students? Again, you can use that QR code to go to Slido, or you can open up a window on your computer and type in slido.com and enter that number 2582167. What did you hear today that might help you with facilitating service learning with your students? Let's just pause for a moment for reflection, because that's what we do a lot here at NYLC, before, during, and after. So let's take a moment. Service learning is a process, not a project. Thank you. The IPARD student experience cycle. Yes, yes. And that is really the center of service learning. And starting with investigation. Sometimes a pathway, a first step is taking a project that you've already done and trying to move towards service learning. That is also another entry point. I encourage you to think about how you might be able to start weaving in investigation into a current project that you might be already doing. Took a screenshot of your circle slide that talks about pre-service, service, and post-service. Reinforcing the importance of service learning. Yes, community service is great, but youth can get way more out of service learning. I loved hearing that it's a process.
Another comment in the chat is, oh, I guess it's up there already, using the IPARD cycle.
That really helps frame, and I would say that young people can take that IPARD that process of solving a community problem, not jumping to a project, but really understanding what the problem is before moving along. Focus on the process, letting go of the control, and letting students guide the process. That can sometimes be a real challenge. Admittedly. Hopefully, I mean, the goal of infusing service learning, and maybe in the beginning stages, weaving it into your unit plan or your lesson plan, it is really to replace what you're doing. So it's not adding on, it's not one more thing, it's just doing things differently. And sometimes that requires small baby steps. So again, that sometimes I think about that slide of all the standards. That's so much to weave in. Start with just one space, one area, one opportunity, one place to begin, to dip your toe into it. So I'm just going to go really quickly through some resources, and maybe Pam can put in the chat how to access some of these resources. This first book that we just created in the last year is called Getting Started in Service Learning. It talks about everything that I just went through. So it is free, it is online. So take a look at that, because that's a really good place to start. It also has a downloadable unit planner. So you can figure out ways to infuse it into what you're already doing, or you can use it as a way to just guide your process. So that's, again, on the resources. There's a textbook for educators, Service Learning by Design. It's really based on backwards planning. So this is a great, if you want to get into real deep pedagogy, this is a great tool. There's also some resources that we have. We created these for the after school programs, but I see a lot of application in our Engage series and our SDG series. It's like it's set up like a 14-week class where there's 14 sessions, an opening, a closing, and content. So if that's something that we see service learning used in a space like an advisory or some other spaces like that as well. So take a look at either the Engage series or on some of these sustainable development goal focused handbooks. Then we also have one of what we're really excited about is that we have our National Service Learning Conference coming up in Nashville, not Memphis, Nashville, in the spring, where we bring together teachers, administrators, in school and out of school professionals. We also welcome and include youth in our programming and in not only our design, but also our presentations. We have a lot of young people who come and share their experiences of service learning. So it's a great opportunity for young people to connect with other young people who are doing this kind of work around the world. So I'm going to pause now to see if there are any other questions. And as Pam helps me monitor the chat function, I am going to say that next at 10:30 Central Time, in another 12 minutes or so, we will have our General Assembly to hear from educators and students on how they're using service learning as a strategy to address the ongoing challenges created by the pandemic, from learning loss and education equity to mental health and trauma. So that'll be happening in a few minutes. Any other final thoughts from our group here? Yes, Pam.
And Julie, if I could, while we're waiting for any comments in the chat, there aren't any yet, but I would also add, we don't have a slide for this, but if you are familiar with NYLC's membership program, we are shifting gears just a little bit. I put a link in the chat. We are calling it a community of practice. We'll be meeting, as we have been, offering once a month live session for really peer networking, peer support, and group coaching. Julie would be the primary lead on that. So if you want to get together with a group of practitioners once a month during the school year, and then some online discussions as well, we've been doing that, and we're shifting a little bit. And I've just this morning got the dates up on the website. So check and see if that's something that you would be interested in joining. Any comments that anyone would like to put in the chat? Questions for Julie? Other thoughts as we get ready to close? We have one participant who says they'll probably be joining us in Nashville. Looking forward to seeing you, Allison.
Yay, Allison.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you, Julie. You're awesome. We've met before one-on-one, and I plan on being at the conference too. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, and this is definitely helping me.
Great, thank you. Nice to see you, Allison. Wonderful. I'm glad we'll see you in person. It'll be a wonderful conference. Really important work. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I was on mute, but there's a couple more folks in the chat. Laura saying thanks for the resources. Beatty, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right, and her students are hoping to join and see us in person. Oh, that would be wonderful.
Yay, our friends from South Africa, I believe. Yes.
And now in Thailand.
Now in Thailand. Oh, okay. All right, terrific. Thank you for being here with us, Beatty. Well, with that, I wish you a farewell. Thank you so much for those of you who joined us near and far. Important work and important community for us to continue to work together, to collaborate, to support young people and the adults who are supporting them. Have a great rest of the forum, and I look forward to seeing some of you in person, and if not, in future forums. Take care.